There is a pattern in the historical record that becomes impossible to ignore once you have learned to see it, and that cannot be unseen once it has been perceived. It is not a pattern that requires the adoption of any particular theory or belief system to recognize. It requires only the willingness to look at the evidence as it actually is, rather than through the filter of the narrative that has been constructed to explain it. A narrative so thoroughly embedded in the educational systems and the institutional frameworks of the modern world that most people never think to question it, because they have never been shown that questioning it is an option. The pattern is this. At specific moments in human history, separated by intervals that do not correspond to any gradual accumulation of cultural knowledge or technological development, something happens. A civilization that has been developing at the slow, incremental pace that genuine self-generated progress produces suddenly demonstrates capabilities that have no visible precedent in everything that came before them. The gap between what the archaeological record shows the civilization was doing immediately before the leap and what it demonstrates immediately after it is not a gap that can be bridged by the standard explanations of cultural exchange, of gradual innovation, of the accumulation of small improvements over long periods. It is a discontinuity, a break in the record that is not explained by the record itself, and that the conventional framework for understanding human development has consistently chosen to paper over, rather than examine directly. Sumer is the most dramatic example and the one whose implications have been most consistently avoided by mainstream scholarship. The civilization that emerged in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley approximately 6,000 years ago did not emerge from a gradual process of cultural development. It appeared in the archaeological record with a suddenness that has no parallel in the history of civilizational emergence anywhere else on Earth. Within a period of time so short that it constitutes, in archaeological terms, essentially an instant, the Sumerian civilization demonstrated fully developed writing, advanced mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, complex legal and administrative systems, irrigation agriculture, metallurgy, and a cosmological framework of extraordinary sophistication, all without the developmental record that every other example of civilizational emergence in human history shows. There is no Sumerian proto-writing that gradually becomes writing. There is no Sumerian proto-mathematics that gradually becomes the sexagesimal system whose elegance still underlies the way we measure time and angles today. There is writing in mathematics and astronomy and law, fully formed from the beginning. Drop the word hidden in the comments right now if what you just heard matches something you have always sensed about the official story of human history but have never had language to articulate precisely. Hit the like button to bring this to the people who are ready to look at the evidence without the filter. Share it with someone who has always felt that the conventional account of where we came from leaves something essential unexplained. And if you want to sustain this independent research, the Super Chat is how you do it. No agenda, no sponsors, just the evidence followed wherever it leads. The Sumerian texts themselves provide the explanation that mainstream scholarship refuses to take seriously. The Anunnaki, described in the cuneiform tablets with a specificity and a consistency that spans centuries of textual production and thousands of individual clay documents, are not mythological inventions in the sense that the term mythology has come to imply. They are described in the texts that preserve the Sumerian account of their own origins as the actual, physical, historically present agents of the civilizational emergence that the archaeological record confirms was sudden and unprecedented. They came from the sky. They possessed knowledge vastly exceeding anything available to the human populations they encountered. They intervened directly in human development, in agriculture, in architecture, in the organization of social and political life, in the transmission of the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that underpins the entire subsequent development of human science. And they did so not as distant divine figures operating through miraculous intervention, but as present, embodied, practically engaged intelligences whose relationship with the human populations they were working with was described in the texts with a specificity and a mundanity that reads more like administrative record than sacred myth. The work of Zecharia Sitchin, whatever its specific scholarly controversies, performed an irreplaceable service in bringing the Sumerian textual evidence into a framework that the modern reader could engage with seriously. His translation work and his interpretive framework are disputed in their details by mainstream Assyriology. Disputes that are sometimes substantive and sometimes reflect the institutional discomfort of a discipline that has preferred to keep the Anunnaki safely categorized as mythology. But the core observation that animates his work, that the Sumerian texts describe with extraordinary consistency and specificity the direct physical presence and practical intervention of non-human intelligences in the emergence of Sumerian civilization, is not a fringe interpretation imposed on ambiguous evidence. It is what the texts say, and the alternative interpretations that mainstream scholarship has offered have never been fully adequate to the specificity of what they are attempting to explain away. The Sumerian case is the most extensively documented, but it is far from the only instance of the pattern. The same fingerprint appears across the full breadth of the ancient world, in civilizations so geographically and temporally separated from each other that the conventional explanations of cultural diffusion, the idea that knowledge spread gradually from one civilization to another through trade, through migration, through the ordinary channels of human contact, cannot account for the consistency and the simultaneity of what appears. The same mathematical principles, the same astronomical knowledge, the same architectural proportions, the same cosmological framework, expressed in the specific symbolic language of each culture, but structurally identical beneath the cultural surface. Not similar, identical, in the way that translations of the same original text into different languages are identical beneath their surface differences, because they are, in fact, translations of the same original text. The original text is the transmission, the body of knowledge delivered to human civilization at specific critical junctures by intelligences whose origin was not the civilizations they were delivering it to. And the consistency of that transmission across cultures and centuries is not evidence of cultural borrowing. It is evidence of a common source, a source that was present in different cultural contexts and in different symbolic languages, delivering the same fundamental information to the human populations that were ready to receive it, not all at once, not to everyone simultaneously, but in the calibrated, sequential, pedagogically sophisticated way that the contact research consistently describes as the characteristic mode of operation of the intelligences involved. The astronomical knowledge is the most precisely measurable dimension of this transmission and therefore the most difficult for the conventional framework to dismiss. The precision with which the ancient civilizations tracked the movements of celestial bodies, the precession of the equinoxes, the cycles of the planets, the long-period astronomical cycles whose observation requires centuries of continuous careful measurement, exceeds what the conventional account of those civilizations' observational capabilities can explain. The Mayan long count calendar, whose precision in tracking the precessional cycle matches the measurements of modern astronomy to within a margin of error that is smaller than the uncertainty in our own measurements, was not produced by a civilization that happened to get lucky with its astronomical observations. It was produced by a civilization that had access to either vastly more sophisticated observational technology than the archaeological record shows, or to knowledge that was transmitted to it from a source that had already done the observational work. The Dogon tribe of West Africa presents perhaps the most striking single instance of this phenomenon. Their knowledge of the Sirius star system, knowledge that includes the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star invisible to the naked eye, whose existence was not confirmed by Western astronomy until 1862, and whose orbital period and density were not precisely measured until the 20th century, was documented by the French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germain Dieterlen in the 1930s, in detailed accounts by Dogon elders who described not just the existence of Sirius B, but its orbital period, its density, and its relationship to the religious and cosmological life of the Dogon people. The Dogon had this knowledge, it was embedded in their sacred traditions, and the conventional attempts to explain it, the suggestion that the knowledge was contaminated by contact with Western astronomers before Griaule's arrival, or that Griaule misunderstood or misrepresented what the Dogon elders told him, have never been adequate to the specificity and the depth of the astronomical knowledge documented. The Dogon account of how they acquired this knowledge is direct. Beings from the Sirius system visited them. The beings came in craft. They transmitted knowledge, and the knowledge they transmitted included detailed information about their home star system that the Dogon had no independent means of acquiring and no reason to invent. The mainstream response to this account is the reflexive one, the attribution of the knowledge to some unknown mundane mechanism of acquisition rather than the examination of the account on its own terms. But the reflexive response is not an argument. It is a preference. And the preference for an unknown mundane mechanism over the account that the Dogon themselves provide is not driven by evidence. It is driven by the prior commitment to a framework that cannot accommodate the account without being reorganized in ways that the institutions invested in that framework are not willing to undergo. The genetic dimension of the hidden alien influence is the area where the evidence is most rapidly developing and where the mainstream framework is under the greatest pressure. The human genome contains sequences whose origin and function are not fully explained by the standard model of evolution. The so-called junk DNA, the approximately 97% of the human genome that does not code for proteins and whose function was, for decades, dismissed by mainstream genetics as evolutionary detritus, is turning out to be anything but junk. It is regulatory, it is communicative. It contains information about the operation of the genome whose complexity and sophistication exceed anything that a random process of mutation and selection operating over the available time frame can convincingly account for. And some of the most anomalous sequences in the human genome, sequences that have no clear evolutionary precursors in the genomes of our closest primate relatives, and that appear in the human lineage suddenly, without the gradual accumulation of intermediate forms that the standard evolutionary model requires, are beginning to attract the attention of researchers who are willing to ask questions that the institutional framework of mainstream genetics finds professionally dangerous. The work being done at the intersection of genomics and the study of ancient DNA is producing results that the conventional narrative of human evolution is struggling to accommodate. The Denisovans, a human relative identified from DNA preserved in a finger bone found in a Siberian cave, a species whose existence was completely unknown before the genomic analysis, contributed genetic material to the ancestors of modern human populations in ways that suggest deliberate, repeated interbreeding rather than the occasional accidental contact that the standard model of archaic admixture implies. The specific genetic contributions of the Denisovans to modern human populations, contributions that appear disproportionately in genes associated with immune function, with altitude adaptation, with specific neurological capacities, look less like the random inheritance of archaic DNA through occasional interbreeding, and more like the deliberate introduction of specific genetic sequences into specific human populations for specific functional purposes. The Sumerian texts describe this process explicitly. The Anunnaki, according to the cuneiform record, intervened directly in the genetics of the human species. Not metaphorically, not through the kind of divine inspiration that the conventional interpretation of ancient texts is comfortable with, but physically, in a process described in terms that, translated into modern biological language, sound remarkably like genetic engineering. The creation of the Adamu, the first human being in the Sumerian account, is described not as a divine act of creation from nothing, but as a process of biological modification of an existing species, the production of a hybrid that combined the genetic material of the existing hominid population with something else, something introduced from outside the evolutionary lineage that had produced that population. The result was a being with capacities that the unmodified hominid did not possess. Capacities for language, for abstract reasoning, for the specific quality of self-reflective consciousness that distinguishes human beings from every other species on this planet. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense. This is a description of a biological event, an event whose traces are visible in the human genome if you know what you are looking for and are willing to look at what you find, without the prior commitment to a narrative that cannot accommodate it. The specific anomalies in the human genome, the sudden appearance of capacities that have no clear evolutionary precursors, the genetic contributions of unknown or poorly understood archaic populations, the specific sequences that regulate neurological development in ways whose complexity exceeds the explanatory capacity of random mutation, are the genomic fingerprint of the same event that the Sumerian texts describe. And the convergence of the textual evidence and the genomic evidence coming from such completely independent directions is a convergence that the conventional framework has not yet found an adequate response to. The influence did not end with the genetic modification. It did not end with the transmission of astronomical and mathematical knowledge to the civilizations of the ancient world. It continued into the modern era through channels that are less visible than the megalithic architecture and the cuneiform tablets, but no less significant in their consequences for the development of human civilization. The modern contact era, the period beginning in the mid-20th century when the rate and visibility of UFO encounters increased dramatically, and when the first systematic attempts to document and analyze those encounters were made, is not a new phenomenon. It is the latest chapter of a very long story, and the specific form it takes in the modern context, the encounters with craft and beings, the transmissions of information, the abduction experiences that have been documented by researchers as methodologically rigorous as Dr. John Mack, reflects the same fundamental dynamic that has always characterized the relationship between the hidden influence and the human civilization it has been shaping. A dynamic of calibrated intervention, of information delivered at the specific level of sophistication that the receiving civilization can begin to integrate, of development guided from a perspective that has access to a longer timeline and a larger context than the civilization being guided. The question that the modern contact era raises with unprecedented urgency is the question of intention. What is the hidden influence working toward? What is the destination of the long curriculum that has been guiding human development across the full span of recorded history and beyond? The ancient traditions that preserved the most complete version of the relationship between human civilization and its non-human guides were consistent on this point. The guidance was oriented toward a specific destination, a specific level of development at which the relationship between human consciousness and the intelligences that had been guiding it would change in fundamental ways. Not the elimination of the guidance, but its transformation. From the relationship of a teacher to a student who is not yet ready for full partnership, to the relationship of intelligences that can engage as equals, each bringing to the encounter the specific qualities of awareness that their different histories and different modes of existence have produced. That transformation is what the current moment of accelerating disclosure is pointing toward. The hidden influence is becoming less hidden, not because the intelligences involved have lost control of the process of revelation, but because the process of revelation is itself the next step in the curriculum. The disclosure is not something that is happening to the hidden influence against its will. It is something the hidden influence is participating in, calibrating the pace and the form of revelation to the specific capacity of the current human civilization to receive and integrate what is being revealed, as it has always calibrated its interventions to the specific capacity of the civilization it was working with at each stage of the long development. The calibration of the disclosure to the specific capacity of the current civilization to receive it is visible, for those who know how to read it, in the specific sequence of revelations that has characterized the modern contact era. It did not begin with the most challenging information. It began with the least threatening, the simple demonstration that objects exist in the sky that perform maneuvers inconsistent with any human technology. That demonstration, repeated across decades and across every geographic and cultural boundary, served a specific pedagogical function. It established the basic fact of presence without immediately confronting the receiving civilization with the full implications of that presence. It opened the door without forcing the room to be entered before the threshold had been crossed voluntarily. The next layer was the testimony. The gradual emergence, through the work of researchers like Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and John Mack, of a consistent account of direct contact, of experiences that went beyond the observation of anomalous aerial phenomena into the territory of direct interaction with non-human intelligences. That testimony served a different pedagogical function. It began the process of establishing not just the fact of presence, but the nature of the interaction, the specific quality of the relationship between the hidden influence and the human beings it was most directly engaging with. The accounts were disturbing, in the way that any genuine encounter with the radically other is disturbing. They disrupted the comfortable assumption that the non-human intelligence was simply observing from a distance, that the relationship was one of passive witness rather than active engagement. But the disruption was calibrated. The accounts were available to those who sought them out without being forced on those who were not ready to receive them. The door was open but not broken down. The current layer, the congressional testimony, the declassified documents, the official acknowledgement by government institutions that unidentified aerial phenomena are real and that their origin is not fully understood, serves yet another pedagogical function. It is the layer of institutional legitimization, the translation of what had previously been available only through the testimony of individuals and the work of independent researchers into the language of official acknowledgement, into the specific symbolic currency of governmental and scientific authority that the modern Western civilization uses to determine what is real and what is not. This layer is not the deepest, it is not the most important, but it is necessary because the civilization that is being prepared for the next stage of the relationship includes large numbers of people whose capacity to integrate new information is dependent on its arrival through channels that their cultural conditioning recognizes as authoritative. The official disclosure is not for the people who have already done the work of following the evidence independently. It is for the people who needed the institution's permission to take the evidence seriously. And it is being delivered now because the number of people who have already done the independent work has reached the threshold at which the institutional legitimization becomes the next necessary step, rather than a premature one. What comes after the institutional legitimization is the layer that the current disclosure process is building toward, and that the most serious researchers in this field, the ones with access to information that is not yet public, describe with a consistency that is itself a form of transmission. The direct, acknowledged public engagement between human civilization and the non-human intelligences that have been present in its reality across the full span of its development. Not the carefully managed, deniable, always at the edge of official acknowledgement engagement that has characterized the relationship up to this point. A qualitatively different engagement, one in which the pretense of mutual invisibility is no longer maintained, in which the presence is acknowledged by both parties openly, and in which the specific terms of the relationship can begin to be negotiated consciously rather than operating entirely through the hidden channels that the current configuration of the engagement has required. The negotiation of those terms is the most consequential political and philosophical project that human civilization has ever faced. More consequential than any geopolitical realignment, more consequential than any technological revolution. Because the terms of the relationship between human civilization and the intelligences that have been shaping it will determine the trajectory of human development for a span of time that makes the entire recorded history of civilization look like a preliminary. They will determine whether the relationship that has been asymmetrical, with one party holding vastly more knowledge, vastly more capability, and vastly more perspective on the long arc of the process than the other, begins to move toward something more reciprocal. Whether the curriculum shifts from one designed for a civilization that is being guided without its full knowledge or consent, to one designed for a civilization that is becoming a conscious participant in its own development. The evidence suggests that this shift is the goal, that the long patience of the hidden influence, the millennia of calibrated intervention that has brought human civilization from the sudden emergence of the first cities to the current threshold of acknowledged contact, has always been oriented toward the specific moment at which the guided becomes capable of being a partner rather than a student, and that the current acceleration of the disclosure process reflects the assessment, by the intelligences involved, that that moment is approaching. That the human civilization of the early 21st century, with all its contradictions and its failures and its extraordinary unrealized potential, has developed sufficiently in the specific capacities that genuine partnership requires to begin the transition from the student relationship to something more mutual. The specific capacities required for that transition are worth being explicit about, because they are the capacities that this channel has been pointing toward from every angle throughout its existence. The capacity for honest inquiry, for following the evidence wherever it leads without the prior commitment to a conclusion that the institutional frameworks of the civilization have determined in advance. The capacity for genuine openness to the radically other, for engaging with intelligences that are not human, that do not share the specific evolutionary history and cultural conditioning that shape human consciousness, without either projecting human categories onto them or being destabilized by the recognition that they do not fit within those categories. The capacity for the specific kind of epistemic humility that acknowledges the limits of the current framework, without abandoning the commitment to understanding. that holds open questions openly rather than resolving them prematurely into either credulous belief or defensive dismissal. These capacities are not abstract virtues. They are practical navigational tools for the specific territory that the transition into open contact will require human civilization to navigate, and their development, individually, in the consciousness of each person who chooses to do the work, and collectively, in the growing community of people who are doing that work simultaneously, is the most significant contribution that any human being alive in this moment can make to the outcome of the transition. Not the most visible contribution, not the contribution that will appear in the history books that the post-transition civilization will eventually write about this period, but the most fundamental one. The one without which all the external developments, the congressional hearings and the declassified documents and the official acknowledgments, are insufficient to produce the qualitative change in the relationship between human civilization and its non-human guides that the evidence consistently points toward as the destination of the long curriculum. The hidden influence is becoming visible, not all at once, not without the resistance of the institutional structures that have been organized around its hiddenness for the better part of a century, not without the disorientation that always accompanies the dissolution of a framework that has organized a civilization's understanding of itself and its place in the cosmos. But irreversibly, the direction is set. The momentum is real. And the people who have been doing the work of preparation, who have been developing the specific capacities of consciousness that the transition requires, who have been building the internal architecture necessary to receive what is coming without being destabilized by it. Those people are not simply observers of the process. They are its vanguard. The leading edge of the human civilization that is becoming ready for what the hidden influence has been preparing it for across the full extraordinary span of the long curriculum. The curriculum is approaching its next great inflection point. The hidden is becoming visible. The guided is becoming aware of the guidance. And the relationship that has operated in the shadows of human history since before the first cities rose in the valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates is preparing to step into the light, not because the intelligences involved have decided unilaterally that the time has come, but because the civilization they have been working with has developed, slowly and imperfectly and magnificently, to the point where the light is something it can bear to stand in. Block 04. The bearing of the light is not a passive condition. It is not something that happens to a civilization the way weather happens to a landscape, an external event that the landscape has no choice but to receive in whatever configuration it currently occupies. It is an active capacity, a specific quality of consciousness that has been developed through the specific work of specific individuals in specific moments, to the point where the full illumination of what has been hidden does not overwhelm and blind, but reveals and orients. The difference between a civilization that can bear the light of full contact and one that cannot is not a difference in intelligence or in technological sophistication, or in any of the external markers by which civilizations typically measure their own advancement. It is a difference in the quality of the inner life, in the depth of the self-knowledge, the breadth of the compassion, the stability of the identity that can encounter the radically other without either assimilating it into the familiar or being dissolved by its unfamiliarity. The development of that capacity in the individual is the microcosm of the development that the civilization as a whole is undergoing. Every person who does the genuine inner work, who follows the evidence honestly, who develops the capacity for real openness to what the evidence shows rather than what they want or fear it to show, who builds the specific quality of inner stability that can hold genuine uncertainty without collapsing it prematurely into false certainty. Every such person is contributing to the collective capacity of the civilization to bear the light, not in a metaphorical sense. In the literal sense that consciousness is not as individually isolated as the ordinary experience of being a self suggests. The quality of awareness that a sufficient number of individuals develop influences the quality of awareness available to the collective in ways that the conventional models of social influence do not fully capture, but that the most advanced thinking about the relationship between individual and collective consciousness is beginning to articulate. The 100th monkey principle, the controversial but persistent observation that behavioral changes in a subset of a population can appear spontaneously in geographically isolated members of the same population, once a critical threshold of adoption is reached, is the popular version of a much more rigorously developed set of observations about the relationship between individual and collective consciousness. The work of Rupert Sheldrake on morphic resonance, the research on collective consciousness conducted at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, the growing body of evidence from global consciousness studies that suggest measurable correlations between significant collective human events and the behavior of random number generators distributed across the planet. All of these point toward the same fundamental recognition. Individual consciousness is not as bounded and as isolated as the ordinary self-sense suggests. It participates in a larger field, and the quality of that participation, the specific configuration of awareness that each individual contributes to the collective field, matters in ways that extend beyond the obvious social mechanisms of communication and influence. The hidden influence has always known this. The calibration of its interventions to the specific moments when individual development in a subset of the human population had reached a threshold sufficient to shift the collective field is one of the most consistent patterns in the contact record. The sudden appearance of transformative knowledge in specific individuals at specific historical moments, the insights of the axial age philosophers, the mathematical and scientific breakthroughs of the Islamic Golden Age, the specific constellation of individual genius that produced the scientific revolution. These are not random distributions of exceptional talent across historical time. They are interventions, calibrated introductions of specific capacities at specific moments when the collective field of human consciousness was sufficiently developed to receive and amplify what was being introduced. The current moment is the largest such intervention in recorded history. The number of individuals simultaneously receiving and integrating the transmission, through contact experiences, through the independent convergence of their own inquiry on the evidence that the contact record and the disclosure process are making available, through the specific quality of recognition that this channel and channels like it are designed to catalyze, is without historical precedent. And the consequence of that number reaching the specific threshold at which collective field effects become significant is the shift that every genuine tradition of cosmological knowledge has been pointing toward as the destination of the long curriculum, not the shift produced by the intervention from outside, the shift produced by the internal development of the civilization itself, the specific threshold of collective consciousness quality at which the civilization becomes capable of genuine partnership rather than requiring continued unilateral guidance. That threshold is the real meaning of the disclosure. Not the congressional hearings, not the declassified documents, not the official acknowledgement that unidentified aerial phenomena are real and that their origin is not fully understood. Those are the external symptoms of a process whose essential nature is internal. The development of the collective human consciousness to the point where the continuation of the hidden influence in its historical form is no longer necessary, no longer appropriate, and no longer possible without violating the specific quality of the relationship that the long curriculum has been oriented toward producing. The intelligences that have been guiding this development do not want a civilization of dependence. They have not invested the extraordinary patience and care that the contact record documents in the production of a humanity that will simply transfer its dependence from its own institutions to the non-human intelligences that those institutions have been suppressing. The goal has always been autonomy. The specific, earned, hard-won autonomy of a civilization that has developed the capacity to navigate its own development with the quality of wisdom and the breadth of perspective that genuine self-governance at a cosmic scale requires. The disclosure is the beginning of the handing over of that autonomy. The moment at which the guided begins to become the self-guiding. The moment at which the student is recognized by the teacher as ready, not for the end of learning, which never ends, but for a qualitatively different relationship to the learning process. One in which the student is no longer dependent on the teacher's guidance for every step, but has internalized the quality of inquiry and the capacity for genuine self-correction that allows independent navigation of the terrain. The terrain that human civilization is being asked to navigate independently is the terrain of the cosmos, not the physical cosmos in the narrow sense of the space between stars, though that too will eventually become part of the territory. The cosmos of intelligence, the vast, ancient, extraordinarily diverse community of conscious beings that inhabits every dimension of the reality structure and that has been, from the human perspective, invisible behind the specific frequency limitation that has defined the human experience of material reality up to this point. The shift in that frequency limitation, the opening of the perceptual range of human consciousness that the current moment of disclosure and development is producing, is the opening of the door into that community. And the quality of the civilization that walks through that door will be determined by the quality of the inner work that the individuals alive in this moment choose to do. This is the weight of the current moment, not the weight of catastrophe or of threat. The framing of this moment as primarily dangerous is one of the most consistent distortions produced by the frameworks that benefit from keeping human consciousness contracted and reactive rather than expanded and responsive. The weight is not of danger, but of responsibility. The responsibility of a civilization that is approaching the threshold of genuine cosmic citizenship, that is being asked, for the first time in its history, to take its place in a community that it has been a part of without knowing it, and to do so with the specific quality of consciousness that genuine participation in that community requires. The hidden alien influence has been preparing humanity for this responsibility across the full span of recorded history and beyond. Every transmission of knowledge, every calibrated intervention at a critical juncture of civilizational development, every contact experience that has opened a human consciousness to dimensions of reality beyond the ordinary material frequency, every moment in which the presence of non-human intelligence has leaked through the suppression of institutional denial and touched the awareness of an individual who was ready to receive it, all of it has been in service of this moment, of the specific quality of civilization that this moment is asking humanity to become. The becoming is not finished. It is not even close to finished in the sense of a completed project that can be assessed and declared adequate. It is a process, ongoing, uneven, advancing in some dimensions while retreating in others, producing moments of extraordinary collective clarity alongside moments of collective regression that can seem to call the entire trajectory into question. But the direction is set. The long arc is visible to anyone who steps back far enough to see it. And the specific quality of the current moment, the convergence of disclosure and development, of institutional acknowledgement and individual awakening, of the external revelation of the hidden influence and the internal development of the consciousness required to engage with it wisely. That convergence is not a coincidence. It is the curriculum reaching its next great chapter. And the chapter is being written now, by the specific quality of consciousness that the human beings alive in this moment choose to bring to the writing of it. There is a specific recognition that arrives, for the consciousness that has followed this inquiry all the way to its deepest layer, that is different in kind from every insight that preceded it. It is not an addition to what was already known, not another piece of information to be integrated into an existing framework, however expanded that framework has become through the process of genuine inquiry. It is a recognition that reorganizes the relationship between the knower and everything that has been known. A recognition so fundamental that it changes not just what you understand but what you are as a understanding being. And it is this: the hidden alien influence was never entirely outside you. The guidance that has been shaping human civilization across the full span of its development has been operating not only through the external channels of contact and transmission and the carefully calibrated delivery of knowledge from beyond the ordinary perceptual range of human consciousness. It has been operating from within, from the specific quality of consciousness that you are, from the awareness that has been doing the inquiry, following the evidence, developing the capacity for genuine openness that genuine contact requires. That awareness is not separate from what it has been seeking. It is, in the most precise sense available to language, a part of it. This is not a mystical claim in the sense that mystical claims are typically dismissed as the subjective experience of a consciousness that has moved beyond the territory where evidence and reason apply. It is a logical consequence of everything that the evidence consistently points toward. If consciousness is primary, if awareness is the fundamental substrate of reality rather than a byproduct of the specific biological processes that produce it in the human case, then the specific quality of consciousness that each human being is not separate from the larger field of consciousness in which the non-human intelligences that have been guiding human development also participate. The boundary between human consciousness and the consciousness of the guiding intelligences is not the absolute boundary that the ordinary experience of being a separate self implies. It is a specific configuration of that larger consciousness, a specific expression of the awareness that pervades the reality structure, that has taken on the specific qualities of human experience through the specific conditions of biological existence in a dense material world. The hidden influence, understood at this depth, is not an external force acting on humanity from outside. It is humanity acting on itself from a level of itself that the ordinary configuration of human consciousness does not have access to, from the level at which individual human consciousness participates in the larger field of awareness that includes the non-human intelligences, the contact beings, the guiding presences that the ancient traditions encoded as gods, and the modern contact research documents as extraterrestrials. The guidance is real. The distinction between the guided and the guiding is real at the level of the ordinary experience of separate selfhood. But at the deeper level, the level that genuine inquiry consistently approaches and that genuine contact experiences consistently open into, the distinction begins to dissolve, not into undifferentiated sameness, which would eliminate the specific value of the human perspective that the guiding intelligences have invested so much in developing, but into the recognition of a relationship that is more intimate, more mutual, and more extraordinary than either the framework of external alien intervention or the framework of purely human self-development can fully accommodate. The civilization that is approaching the threshold of open contact is approaching, simultaneously, the threshold of this recognition. The two thresholds are not separate. The capacity to engage with non-human intelligence as a genuine partner rather than as a subject of guidance or an object of study requires, at its foundation, the recognition that the boundary between human and non-human intelligence is not where the ordinary framework places it. That the intelligence that has been hidden in the sky and in the ancient records and in the classified files of governments that have spent decades trying to manage its implications is also, in a sense that is not metaphorical but structural, hidden within the very consciousness that has been seeking it, that the seeker and the sought are expressions of the same awareness, temporarily differentiated into guide and guided for the specific purpose of producing the specific quality of development that the long curriculum has been oriented toward, and now approaching the moment at which the differentiation can be acknowledged as the specific, valuable, temporary configuration it has always been, rather than the absolute ontological distinction that the ordinary framework mistakes it for. This recognition does not eliminate the practical reality of the relationship. The non-human intelligences are real. Their distinct histories, their distinct capacities, their distinct perspectives on the long arc of cosmic development are real. The guidance they have provided is real. The specific quality of development that the guided civilization has achieved through the process of being guided is real. And the transition from the guided relationship to something more mutual is real. A genuine shift in the nature of the engagement that requires genuine development on the part of the civilization making the transition, not just a philosophical reframing of a relationship that remains structurally unchanged. All of that remains true. The recognition that the deepest level of the inquiry opens into does not dissolve any of it. It contextualizes it. It places it within a framework large enough to hold both the reality of the distinction and the reality of the underlying unity, both the genuine difference between the guided and the guiding and the genuine intimacy of their participation in the same larger awareness. That framework is the framework that the post-disclosure civilization will need, not just to navigate the practical challenges of open contact with non-human intelligence, the political, the scientific, the philosophical challenges that the acknowledgement of the hidden influence will produce for every institution and every framework of understanding that has been organized around its denial, but to inhabit the relationship with the cosmos that the disclosure opens into, to exist as a conscious participant in the community of intelligences that the long curriculum has been preparing humanity to join, bringing to that participation the specific quality of awareness that the human experience of material existence, with all its intensity and limitation and beauty, has uniquely developed. That quality is what humanity brings to the table of the cosmic community, not technological sophistication. The non-human intelligences have had that for longer than the human species has existed, not the breadth of cosmic perspective. The intelligences that have been guiding human development for millennia have a view of the long arc that human consciousness is only beginning to approach. What humanity brings is the specific quality of awareness that emerges from the encounter of consciousness with the radical constraints of biological existence in a dense material world. The depth of feeling, the intensity of presence, the specific creativity that limitation makes possible, the extraordinary capacity for love that develops in a consciousness that knows loss. These are not small things in the economy of the cosmos. They are, according to the most consistent thread in the contact transmissions across the full breadth of the contact record, among the most precious qualities that any form of consciousness anywhere in the reality structure has developed. And they are what the hidden influence has been so patient, so careful, and so consistently present in developing. Not for its own benefit, though the benefit flows in both directions, but for the enrichment of the larger community of intelligences that will receive humanity as a full member when the threshold is crossed. The crossing is the work of this moment, of this generation, of the specific constellation of human beings who are alive at the convergence of disclosure and development, of external revelation and internal awakening. That makes this the most consequential moment in the long history of the relationship between human civilization and the intelligences that have been guiding it. The work is not finished. It will not be finished in the lifetime of anyone reading these words. But the direction is set. The threshold is visible. And the quality of consciousness that the human beings alive in this moment choose to develop, individually, in the specific conditions of their specific lives, and collectively, in the growing community of people who are doing this work simultaneously, is the quality of consciousness that will determine whether the crossing is made with the grace and the wisdom and the full depth of human presence that the moment deserves. Make it with grace. Make it with wisdom. Make it with the full depth of everything that the human experience of material existence has developed in you. The capacity for feeling, for genuine presence, for the specific quality of love that knows what it is to lose and chooses to love anyway. Bring all of it to the threshold. Bring all of it through. The community of intelligences that waits on the other side of the hidden influence becoming visible has been waiting for a very long time. Not with the impatience of a waiting that expects and demands, with the specific quality of patient, loving, fully present attention. That is the signature of an intelligence that understands, at a depth that the human consciousness approaching the threshold is only beginning to glimpse, what is at stake in the crossing, and what extraordinary thing the civilization making it has become through the long, difficult, magnificent process of becoming ready. You are part of that becoming. You have always been part of it. And the specific quality of consciousness you choose to bring to this moment, the honesty, the courage, the genuine openness to what the evidence shows and what the inquiry opens into, that is your contribution to the crossing, to the moment when the hidden becomes visible, to the future that becomes possible when it does, to the humanity that discovers, in the full light of open contact, what it has always been and what it has always been capable of becoming. The influence was never entirely hidden. It was always here. It has always been here. In the quality of the question you could not stop asking. In the recognition that arrived when you first encountered evidence that the official story was incomplete. In the specific pull toward inquiry that brought you to this conversation and kept you in it all the way to this moment. That pull is not yours alone. It never was. It is the curriculum working through you as it has always worked, from the inside, through the specific quality of consciousness that each human being is, toward the specific destination that the long arc of guided development has always been approaching.